We are going to continue with our discussions on the teachings of Lord Caitanya. We begin. Namo Padaya Krishna Prasaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Namo Krishna Padaya Krishna Prasaya Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Nirvishesha Nirvahari Vatsya Vishtarine Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Nirvishesha Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Vatsya Vishtarine Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhari Vasari Gaura Bhaktivedanta Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhari Vasari Gaura Bhaktivedanta Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hari Om, Hari Om, Gaura Hari Om, Jai Gaura Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om, Jai Gaura Hari Om, Jai Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Jai Prabhupada, Jai Prabhupada, 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 Jai Jai Prabhupada, Jai Jai Gurudev, Jai Gurudev, Jai Gurudev, 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 Jai Jai Gurudev. Shri Gaura Hari Ki Jai, Shri Prabhupada Ki Jai, Shri Rajali Padma Ki Jai, Shri Shri. So again, thank you all so much for joining us. We will chant our prayers. Om Jnana-timirandasya Vinashakaya Chakshurmilitanena Tasmai Gurave Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Bhagavamaya Purati Swapam Om Vishnupadaya Vishnupadaya Bhutale Bhaktivedanta Swami Namaste Saraswati Devi Gaurani Prachari Sheshashanagari Astra Pradeshtari. Again, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We have been discussing thus far the teachings of Lord Chaitanya. This is wonderful book by Srila Prabhupada, based on the authorized biography of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, which is called Chaitanya Charity, written by Srila Kaviraj Swami. So we are up to chapter 20, and I pray for all your blessings with us for this class, which is the first part of chapter 20, so we can all have a better idea of the Lord's teachings and pastimes, so we can serve Him with them. So this chapter is called the goal of Vedanta study. So just to recap, last week, Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu had teaching the sannyasis, follow the Mayavad doctrine in Benares, which is now called Varanasi. It's called Benares and Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's pastimes. So these sannyasis were led by great Prakashananda Saraswati, and they had been very charmed by Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's beauty and his wonderful personality and his authoritative, clear explanations of Vedanta, and they wanted to hear more, although the Lord was concerned that it would be opposite to what they had been trained in. But they assured him that they wanted to hear more about it, so the Lord is explaining to them, and we will benefit from these explanations today. So we will chant the invocation prayer to begin. This is verse 18 of the first chapter of the Chaitanya. Jai Jai Shri Chaitanya Jai Nityananda Jai Advaita Chandra Jai Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Jai Jai Shri Chaitanya Jai Nityananda Jai Advaita Chandra Jai Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Jai Jai Shri Chaitanya Jai Nityananda Jai Advaita Chandra Jai Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. The translation is glory to Shri Chaitanya and Nityananda, glory to Advaita Chandra, and glory to all the devotees of Shri Gaura Chaitanya. So begin reading. It is concluded that Lord Krishna, or Vishnu, is not of the material world. He belongs to the spiritual world. One who considers him to be a demigod of the material world is a great offender of Dasi. Lord Vishnu is not subject to perception by material senses, nor can he be realized by mental speculation. Unlike in the material world, where there is always a difference between the body and the soul, there is no difference between the body and the soul of the Supreme Lord Vishnu. So there's a common thinking that Lord Vishnu is the maintainer, Lord Brahma is the creator, and Lord Shiva is the destroyer. And this may sort of neatly tie up the roles of these personalities, but it also implies that they're equal. And as clearly stated by the Lord, they're not equal. Even the impersonalist believes that they're equal because it then gives them a way of explaining how the functions of the world are being carried out by Brahman. They say it's through these personalities. For that, of course, they have to claim that these persons from Vishnu and Shiva are all basically inhabiting material forms and carrying out the orders of Brahman. And in that way, they also equate these personalities to us, that they are simply this holy trinities. They are more enlightened Jiva, or enlightened living entity, and that if we get enlightened, we can actually be on the same level as them. Now, obviously, we can understand that this is not possible at all. The obvious snag comes from the Vedas itself, which the impersonalists do base their teachings on. And of course, many other sectors of the Sanatana Dharma religion, called Hinduism, like those who worship the demigods, those who perform mystic yoga, many do believe in the Vedas. So the Vedas, particularly the Rig Veda and the Purusha Shukta prayers of the Rig Veda, extol Lord Vishnu as the supreme creator, as the supreme Lord, as the origin of all. And these prayers are also chanted by the demigods. We read in Srimad Bhagavatam when they go to approach Lord Vishnu for help in dealing with the demoniac elements in the world, meaning that they also acknowledge the Lord to be their controller and creator. And we will quote Lord Brahma from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 2, Chapter 6, where he confirms the Purusha Shukta prayers, and he says of Lord Vishnu, by his will I create, Lord Shiva destroys, and he himself, in his eternal form as the personality of Godhead, maintains everything. He is the powerful controller of these three energies. So it makes it very clear that Lord Vishnu is the controller. that he empowers Lord Shivan and Brahma to perform their functions, and he personally takes charge of the maintenance of the living entities, although he actually has nothing to do with material nature. And we'll read a bit more about that later on. So, in affirming that Krishna, Vishnu is the source of all, Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, chapter 10, text 8, that he is the source of all the spiritual and material worlds, and that everything emanates from him. He states that those who are wise will know this and will therefore engage in his service. And obviously, those who are foolish, they don't not only understand this, but they also try to demean the Lord and elevate themselves falsely to his level, say that they can become enlightened and then become just like him. So we carry on reading. Material things are enjoyed by the living entities because the living entities are superior in quality, whereas material nature is inferior. Thus, the superior nature, the living entities, can enjoy the inferior nature of matter. So the living entities have the same quality of the Lord. The Lord is known as the supreme enjoyer. He is the supreme soul. We are small souls. So we have this quality of enjoying, but we can't get that enjoyment in the sense of being an enjoyer as well. We are meant to be enjoyed. We are meant to be servants. So we have a kind of enjoyment that comes with being a servant. So we can take the example that a servant of a very kind and generous master is also well taken care of themselves. They're comfortable, they're secure, they're content. So as the servants of the Supreme Lord, we will definitely get enjoyment from serving him, who is so loving and merciful towards us, for he always takes care of us in every way. And when we try to enjoy on our own, this is when we have to come to the material world, because enjoyment for us is not natural. There is only one place in which we can accomplish this, and that's the material world. And everything here is temporary, miserable, and full of ignorance. So what enjoyment actually can it offer? So basically, there is no concept of independent enjoyment. We've just come here to experience suffering, whether we actually want to admit it or not. So when we give up this tendency to enjoy ourselves and we engage in the service of the Lord, then we find an interesting development. Through that service, we experience an enjoyment. There's some rules and regulations. There's some asperities we've got to give up. Some material pleasures and things that we might like. Like today's Nirjala Ekadasi, many devotees are fasting without food and also water. So that could be considered an austerity. But yet, devotees enjoy this. They relish these kind of rules and regulations, this way of showing their love for the Lord. So Srila Prabhupada explains this very nicely in relation to his own disciples, where he explained that even though they had been so accustomed to material pleasures, they had gained a higher taste, a higher pleasure, a higher enjoyment in serving Krishna. And this, of course, overtook the artificial material pleasure that we get. And it made that service to Krishna not only more superior, but also more natural. One would think that it was foreign to them, foreign to all of us, since it's not what we're accustomed to, this process of devotional service. But it actually is natural for the living entity because our eternal natures are spiritual souls and servants of Krishna. Now, the impersonalists, they also do know that material enjoyment is really not worth pursuing, so they do give this up. But the problem is they don't have any concept of spiritual enjoyment. So their path is negation of material enjoyment, but no concomitant spiritual enjoyment. So it's actually their path that's difficult, not the path of Bhakti Yoga. Their path actually is to use all kinds of enjoyment or relish, we could say, in the process of serving the Lord. And actually, it's more foreign to the soul. The soul seeks pleasure. That's why everyone is after enjoyment in this world. The impersonalists try to deal with this tendency of the soul by forcefully detaining their senses from all material pleasure, and that doesn't work. Srila Prabhupada explains that if one tries to forcefully control a child who is behaving mischievously, one will probably fail and waste a lot of energy in it. But if one gives that child something constructive to engage in, then the child will not only give up the bad habits, but you actually find a transformation in such children. They're involved in something, they display their talents, we see a side of them that we wouldn't have seen before. So this is the spiritual, this is the effect of devotional service on us. It is a spiritual relish, it is higher sense of enjoyment, it's more natural for the soul, and it's also transformative. And this is what we gain in trying to please Krishna alone. Because Lord Vishnu is in no way touched by matter, he has no tendency to enjoy material nature the way the living entities do. The living entities cannot attain knowledge of Vishnu by enjoying their habits of mental speculation. The infinitesimal living entities are not enjoyers of Vishnu, but they are enjoyed by Vishnu. Only the greatest offender thinks that Vishnu is enjoyed. The greatest blasphemy is to consider Vishnu and the living entity on the same level. So now this point clarifies that we may get some sense of relish from devotional service, but we're not expecting enjoyment from the Lord. That's the difference. When we are engaged in the service of the Lord and we're back to our original position, we do get a sense of satisfaction from this. And it is natural that one will experience more, like we said, a relish in performing the service. But it's not that we demand enjoyment from the Lord through his service or in any other way. For that, as Sri Prabhupada says, would be being offensive towards him. If we feel that the relish is missing, then we look to our practices and see how we can improve ourselves so that we can better go through the process of devotional service. But we don't demand enjoyment from the Lord. So the impersonalists think that they're above the ordinary material enjoyer who just wants possessions from Krishna, just wants material objects, money, fame, because the impersonalist thinks we've given all of that up, so we're not material enjoyers. But they are enjoyers in a different sense, because, as explained here, they enjoy mental speculation. They enjoy twisting the Lord's word so that they get praise and they get renown from others. So this is definitely material enjoyment because it is solely for their service. So they are certainly material enjoyers also. The supreme absolute truth, the personality of Godhead, is compared to a blazing fire, and the innumerable living entities are compared to sparks emanating from that fire. Although both the Supreme Lord and the living entities are qualitatively fire, there is yet a distinction. Vishnu, the Supreme, is infinite, whereas the living entities, who are but sparks, are infinitesimal. The infinitesimal living entities are emanations from the original infinite spirit. In their constitutional position as infinitesimal spirits, there is no trace of matter. So this is very clear, and it has to be stated so that these Mayavadis, sannyasis that the Lord is preaching to, understand the difference between the Lord and them, that they get it clear that there is a difference, that they can never be on the level of the Lord, and that the Lord himself is not like any of the demigods or us. There's no trace of matter in him. So this is a very nice example, that of the fire and the sparks. So the Lord is like the fire, and the living entities, we also call living entities jivas. We'll be using that term in the class as well. So the living entities or the jivas are like sparks from the fire. One can understand that the spark has the same quality of the fire. The spark is red, for example, and hot like fire. But the amount of power that the spark has and the amount of and the amount of power that the fire has is different. The spark is just a little red, whereas the fire can light up quite a large area. The spark is a little hot, and the fire is very hot. So in the same way, the Supreme Lord is infinitely powerful compared to us. We have the same qualities, but certainly not in the same quantity. And also in the same way that a spark can fall out of the fire and then lose its powers to a degree depending on where it falls. We fall into an atmosphere where the Lord is not. We fall into Maya, and this is how we lose the sense of our qualities. We lose the sense of our eternality, our bliss, our knowledge. But the Lord can never fall into such an environment because the fire itself keeps burning. So the Lord, whether he's here, whether he's in the spiritual world, he always remains spiritual. There's never a trace of matter in him. So Sri Prabhupada explains a bit more about this. Just as a spark comes from fire, and when the spark falls down, it appears to be extinguished. The spark of soul originally comes from the material world, spiritual world, the material world. In the material world, he falls down into three different conditions, which are called the modes of nature. When the spark falls on dry grass, the fiery quality continues. When the spark falls on the ground, it cannot display its fiery manifestation unless the ground is favorably situated. And when the spark falls on water, it becomes completely extinguished. As such, we find three conditions of living entities. One living entity is completely forgetful of his spiritual nature. This is a person in ignorance. Another is almost forgetful, but still has an instinct of spiritual nature. This is those in the mode of passion. And another is completely in search of spiritual perfection. These are the modes. This is someone in the mode of goodness. There is a bona fide method for the attainment of spiritual perfection by the spiritual spark of soul, and if he is properly guided, he is very easily sent back home, back to Godhead, wherefrom he originally fell, where he can resume his qualities again. The living entities are not as great as Narayan, Vishnu, who is beyond this material creation. Even Shankaracharya accepts Narayan to be beyond the material creation. Since neither Vishnu nor the living entity are of the material creation, someone may inquire, why were the small particles of spirit created at all? The answer is that the Supreme Absolute Truth is complete in his perfection when he is both infinite and infinitesimal. If he was simply infinite but not infinitesimal, he would not be perfect. The infinite portion is the Vishnu Tattva, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and the infinitesimal portion is the living entity. This is a little esoteric, but we will explain in the next few paragraphs a little more about the points being made here. Basically, we're trying to understand why the living entity needs to exist at all. So if there was only the infinite Supreme Lord, then he wouldn't, we could say, be perfect on his own. The infinite Lord, the definition of perfection includes all his parts and parcels. The infinite and the infinitesimal are also perfect, especially when we're considering those who are existing in the spiritual world as Nitya devotees. Therefore, they are able to exchange infinitely loving spiritual affairs. So we can take an example to understand this a bit better. So if we consider somebody who is perfect in this world, that person is perfect also in relation to those around them. We think of this perfect person, but we also think that they must have perfect family relations, perfect friendships, a perfect job, a perfect colleague, and so on. So we see that the definition of perfect extends not just to the person, but also to everyone around them, because anyone who exists as a person exists as a person relative to others. So the Supreme Person also has his infinitesimals who are perfect when they are the Nityasiddha devotees in the spiritual world. And those who are Nityabada, or conditioned in the material world, through devotional service can become perfect and return to the Lord to engage in those perfectly loving affairs. If Brahman was the Supreme, as the impersonalists claim, then Brahman could have just existed as eternity forever. There wouldn't have been any need to create or to have infinitesimal parts and parcels, living entities or jivas. But here we all are, and the impersonalists don't really have any good explanation for this. Why would a formless and personality free supreme being of light need to create anything, or actually need to do anything? Because for creation to happen, there must be desire. The being of light, who doesn't have a spiritual personality, doesn't have desire. So that's why the impersonalists think that they have to stop their desire so they can be on the same level as this Brahman that they have imagined to be the supreme. And so, as we explained before, they artificially try to stop desire. But it still doesn't answer the question as to why is there creation and why are there living entities. So for that, they say that this whole creation was actually not exactly created, that it has just been ever existing. And this again negates the Vedas, because the Vedas clearly say that there is a creation, that Vishnu, of course, is the creator. So the Mayavadis basically can't explain their beliefs based on that either. Even if we thought that there was no creation and all the living entities were just always existing, why are they existing? Why are they here in the material world? Why do they have to undergo so much of suffering? Why do they have to come to the impersonalist platform, for example, understand so much through speculation, go through all of that self-realization, only to become one again with Brahman, to stop existing, and then basically never use the knowledge of the intelligence and the speculation they've gained. So basically, none of it really makes a lot of sense. But yet they kind of claim that Bhakti, which is so goal directed, makes no sense to them. This is the irony. Due to the infinite desires of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the spiritual world exists. And due to the infinitesimal desires of the living entity, the material world exists. So this clearly states that the Supreme Person has desires. He's a person, he has a personality, and those personalities have desires. Being a person with a personality doesn't make him material. Being a material person with a material personality and material desires is what makes him material. But since he is a spiritual person with a spiritual personality and spiritual desires, and of course a spiritual form, he's spiritual. So this is how the Supreme Personality of Godhead is able to be a person and have these wonderful infinite desires. And it's always for the good of everyone. That's what spirit is. It's absolute. In the material world, what I think is good for me is not good for you. Therefore, it's relative. Everything is relative in the material world. But in the spiritual world, everything is absolute. So every desire of Krishna is good, not just for him, but for everyone. And also, he has the ability to fulfill his desires. This is why he has infinite power. As compared to us, we can't fulfill all our desires. This is what we need material nature for. Material nature is there to fulfill desires that are for us, as we explained before. Anything that's for me is material. Anything that's for Krishna is spiritual. So naturally, of course, when we have desires fulfilled through the material nature, it's temporary, it's miserable, and it's ignorant. It's always the same. Whatever that desire is, as long as it's material. But as long as that desire is purely for Krishna, it is coming from him, coming from us, then it's good for all. Spiritual. When the infinitesimal living entities are engaged in trying to fulfill their infinitesimal desires for material enjoyment, they are called Jiva Shakti. But when they are dovetailed with the infinite, they are called liberated souls. There is no need to ask, therefore, why God created the infinitesimal portions. They are simply the complementary side of the Supreme. Because in any relationship between persons, there must be two people for any relationship to exist. So we complement the Lord. Therefore, we have the same qualities as the eternity, knowledge, and peace. It is doubtlessly essential for the infinite to have infinitesimal portions, which are inseparable parts and parcels of the Supreme Soul. Because the living entities are infinitesimal parts and parcels of the Supreme, there is a reciprocation of feelings between infinite and infinitesimal. Had there been no infinitesimal living entities, the Supreme Lord would have been inactive and there would not be any variegatedness in spiritual life. There would be no meaning to a king if there were no subjects. And there would be no meaning to the Supreme God if there were no infinitesimal living entities. How can there be any meaning to the word Lord if there's no one to rule? The conclusion is that the living entities are expansions of the energy of the Supreme Lord, and that the Supreme Lord, personality of Godhead, Krishna, is the energetic. This is an elegant explanation as to why the theory of impersonalness doesn't make any sense. If all of us can just become enlightened and become God, then what is the meaning to God? It's like if you have a king and everyone else in the kingdom also becomes a king. What's the meaning or what's the value of being a king? There's no one to rule over. Everybody's equally a ruler in that right. One has to be a subject. One has to have subjects in order to be a king, and in the same way, God has to have subordinates in order to be God. If there's no one for him to be Lord and Master of, then what's the meaning of being God? The title of God actually exists relative to others who are subordinate, and therefore, again, we explained that the infinite Lord has to have infinitesimal particles. If he doesn't, then there's no meaning to him being supreme. So, to believe basically that everyone is God is actually to believe that no one is God also. It's actually to make the office of God obsolete. So we see how it actually doesn't make sense, and why Prabhupada says that impersonalism is actually atheism. It's doing away with God. And if you think about it, it's quite strange that the impersonalists would want so much to avoid surrendering to Krishna, that they'd want so much to avoid rendering devotional service, that they would basically go to the extent of believing so many things that don't make sense, that they actually go against a lot of the Vedic teachings, if not the whole Vedic canon. And for all their trouble, of course, it is also based quite a bit in atheism, and for all their trouble, they only get a temporary spell in Brahman, which is just to teach them a lesson, not to try to be God. So you can imagine that to just try to avoid submitting to devotional service, one just decides to throw in the towel and end their existence for good in Brahman to avoid being a servant. It's quite surprising. Only the thing that they don't understand is that it's their false ego that's speaking. It's a false ego that is trying so hard not to be a servant of Krishna. When they change their bodies, their sense of false ego will change as well. The only thing that's actually consistent is the nature of the soul to want to be a servant of Krishna. In all Vedic literatures, including the Bhagavad Gita and Vishnu Purana, much evidence is given to distinguish between the energy and the energetic. In the Bhagavad Gita, this is chapter 7, text 4, it is clearly stated that earth, water, fire, air, and ether, which are the 5 gross elements of the material world, and mind, intelligence, and false ego, which are the 3 subtle elements, are the Lord's energies. All material nature is divided into these 8 elements, which together comprise his inferior nature or energy. Another name for this inferior nature is Maya. So Krishna very clearly states in this verse, chapter 7, text 4, that he is the origin, the source, the Lord, the master of all the material energies, and he explains what these energies are composed of, these 8 elements. And in the verse that follows this, which is chapter 7, text 5, he also says that there is another spiritual energy of these. And these are the living entities who are trying to exploit the resources of the material nature. So Krishna is making it abundantly clear that all of us, material nature and living entities, are his energies and are under his control. Beyond these 8 inferior elements is his superior energy, which is called Para-Prakriti. This Para-Prakriti comprises the living entities who are found in great numbers throughout the material world. The purport is that the Supreme Lord is the absolute truth, the energetic, and that as such he has energies. Right? So he's the energetic who owns the energies, and we are his energetic. He is the energetic who owns the energies, and we are his energies who must serve the energetic. When one of his energies is not properly manifested, or when it is covered by some shadow, it is called Maya Shakti. The material cosmic manifestation is a product of that Maya Shakti. So Srimad Bhagavatam also explains this in the 3rd canto, that the Lord is ruling over all of his energies who are there to serve him. And so he can never come under the rule of his energies. And particularly the material nature, the impersonalists say that the Lord is comparable to us, the demigods, because he comes under control of material nature like us. But clearly the Lord is speaking that this energy, this material energy, belongs to him. So how he can come under it is actually impossible. It's like I have a hand and I have a power to lift this hand. So it belongs to me. I can choose how to use it. Power can't be used on me. Power can't develop an ability. It can help to do anything with this. So in the same way, the Lord can never accept his own energies or powers. But one energy can overcome the other energy. So here we're understanding that the living entities can be covered by the shadow of Maya. They can be covered by the influence of Maya. So in the same way, my power of lifting can overcome my power to keep my hand at rest. But at the end of the day, both powers are actually meant to serve me the most. So in the same way, all the powers, the living entities and Maya, they're all there to serve the Lord. So even when the living entities come to the material world and try to enjoy separately of the Lord and go through so much of suffering, and when Maya tries to or has to bewilder them to learn their lessons, both are actually still, in a way, acting in all service. Living entities are learning their lessons through their sufferings. Hopefully, this awakens them to understanding they can't enjoy separately, and Maya's enforcing those lessons. She's administering the punishments on behalf of the Lord so that the living entities can get reformed and go back to the Lord. So we can see then that this material creation does have a purpose. And actually that purpose is meant to liberate us. It's not meant to keep us here to suffer forever. It's meant to help us. Maya bodies don't have an idea of what this creation is for, but we know. It's not either for suffering, stay here forever, and it's not meant for us to end up in nothing afterwards in Brahman. It's meant for us to actually attain liberation, actually be over our suffering. Because the Lord who has complete control over this manifestation, he's not sitting up in the material world and enjoying our suffering. He's not happy that we're going through so many bad reactions for our misbehavior against him. Like a completely spiritual, loving person, someone who always wants the ultimate good for us as the absolute good. He's actually with us all the time. He came with us to the material world. He's the super soul that's sitting beside us as we go through all the suffering, feeling concerned and just waiting for us to turn to him. He's patient. He's been with us for millions of lifetimes. So we remember that famous analogy from the Upanishads of the two birds sitting on the tree and the super souls witnessing the sufferings of the living entity, just waiting for that living entity to turn back to him. The living entities are factually beyond this covered inferior energy. They have their pure spiritual existence, their pure identity, and their pure mental activities, all beyond the manifestation of this material cosmos. Although the living entity's mind, intelligence, and identity are beyond the range of this material world, when he enters into this material world due to his desire to lord it over matter, his original mind, intelligence, and body become covered by the material energy. When he is free again of the covering of this material inferior energy, he is called liberated. When he is liberated, he has no false ego, but his real ego again comes into existence. Foolish mental speculators think that after liberation, one's identity is lost, but that is not so. So we've explained this before, and we'll just go through it again. These material energies that Krishna has mentioned above, he said that there were 5 gross elements and 3 subtle elements. So the 3 subtle energies are mind, intelligence, and false ego. So we also have a spiritual counterpart to these 3 energies. So Sri Prabhupada is explaining that we have spiritual mind, spiritual intelligence, spiritual ego, and all of these being of the same quality of the soul are they eternal. They're not actually different from the soul. But when we come to the material world to enjoy these spiritual elements, mind, intelligence, false ego, they become covered because one's not acting as a servant anymore. The spiritual identity is there for service. So we come to the material world to enjoy. So we get a false identity, a false ego, an ego of an enjoyer, of a controller. So this false ego covers the soul. And through the process of devotional service, we actually have to uncover that spiritual identity again. We have to be free of the material contaminations of the false ego, which happens by the time we reach the stage of Sakti, devotional service. And then we would have uncovered through devotional service what our real identity is, and we can engage in devotional service in that proper identity again to please the Lord to a very pure level. So without devotional service, we understand that the soul can't develop its original personality. The original personality, that spiritual mind, intelligence, and false ego, is meant for service. That's what makes it spiritual. So since it doesn't, someone who doesn't engage in devotional service, like the Mayavadis, can't exactly develop their personality of service, they assume that it doesn't exist. So whereas the Mayavadis do understand that there's a false ego, that it's not who they are, that it's covering them, they don't actually know who they know who they're not. They're not this false ego, but they don't know who they are. They don't know the real ego. The process that they follow, spiritual realization, which is called jnana, it can't offer them what bhakti can. Jnana is rooted in their desire to be controller, the desire that is so strong that they actually want to take it all the way to becoming God. Whereas bhakti is rooted in serving Krishna, and therefore it is completely spiritual. So without bhakti, one cannot uncover one's true nature of servitude. So the Mayavadis, this process that they employ called Jnana Yoga, does involve knowledge, but it's not the same as knowledge in devotional service. If knowledge is completely used for the service of the Lord, that knowledge is spiritual and it's actually bhakti, but nothing to do with jnana. Jnana, the knowledge that the Mayavadis are trying to employ, is for their service, it's for them to become one with God. They're competing with Krishna, therefore Krishna, the Sri Prabhupada called it demonic. Someone's competing with God, and it makes them a demon. That's the difference of how they employ the knowledge. So the impersonalists are using their jnana to realize that they're the false ego, but they're not trying at all to develop the real ego of devotion through devotional service. They basically conclude that when the false ego is finished, everything is finished. We can understand why, in a way. Once they end their identity that they're currently possessing, there's nothing else for them. There's no other thoughts, there's no other desires, there's nothing spiritual, there's no personality. So that's what leads them to believe that after self-realization, after overcoming the false ego, after knowing that yes, I am the soul, this is the level of self-realization, they think there's nothing after that. They don't have any idea of spiritual identity or spiritual personality. So it suits them to have a supreme Brahman that they're trying to attain, who also has personality. And so Brahman is their preferred idea of God. They feel that once they've attained the self-realization, overcoming the false ego, knowing that I'm the soul, that this is radiance now. They've arrived. But for us, we know that's only the beginning. To know that we're the soul is the first stage of spiritual realization, also Sambandha Gyan. From there, one can actually engage in Abhideya and pure devotional service and then get to Prayoja. So for the devotee, it's actually the beginning of devotional service. Because the living entity is eternally part and parcel of God, when he is liberated, he revives his original, eternal part and parcel identity. The realization of Aham Brahmasmi, or I am spirit, not this body, does not mean that the living entity loses his identity. So what does this mean for devotees of the Lord? So we all actually have to come to the stage of Aham Brahmasmi, knowing that we are not the spirit. Now, it's not the same as just having knowledge. Anyone who comes to the basic understanding of spiritual life hears that we are not the body and we are the soul. But it's very different knowing that and actually realizing it. This is the difference with the stage of self-realization. Srila Prabhupada explains it in Science of Self-Realization, chapter 5. Simply to understand that God is seated in everyone's heart is not perfection. One has to be acquainted with God from within and without, and thus act in Krishna consciousness. So it means just knowing is not enough. It's the first part of the journey. But to actually realize the knowledge and then act from this knowledge, which is when we say we actually engage in pure devotional service, this is actually what we're aiming for. So what we're doing now, while we don't have that realization, is the practice of devotional service. So therefore it's called devotional practice. Real devotional service begins at that stage where we realize that we are souls. So the impersonalists, they get to this point. They get to this point of knowing that they're the soul, realizing it, and now it's the opportunity to act from it in devotional service. But instead, they feel the qualities of the soul. They feel the eternity, the knowledge and bliss, because the false ego has been removed. Now they understand what the qualities of the soul are, but for them it makes them feel that we're not Brahman. They are feeling the qualities of Brahman, but they don't understand that they're not Brahman in quantity at all. So for devotees, this of course is where pure devotional service begins, where Abhideya begins. And so it is actually the real beginning in spiritual life. At the present moment, a person may consider himself to be matter, but in his liberated state, he will understand that he is not matter, but spirit soul, part of the infinite. To become Krishna conscious or spiritually conscious and to engage in the transcendental loving service of Krishna are signs of the liberated stage. So this is a progression. We actually practice devotional service. We get to this liberated stage where we understand that we are not the false ego. We understand that we're the soul. And we actually begin the real process of devotional service, pure devotional service. And this is actual realization. This is actual liberation. The impersonalists, they think they're liberated, but they actually haven't developed their spiritual identity. So where are they going to go? Therefore, we understand that they basically have to stay out of the spiritual world until they have a personality of service that is suitable to influence, and that is only attained through devotion. Thank you all so much for your kind attention. Please join us next week when we continue this chapter 20. Are there any comments or questions or anything I can clarify? Correct.
Hare Krishna, dear Mataji. Please accept my humble obeisances. All glory to Lord Prabhupada. Thank you very much for wonderful class. Today, no questions from my side. Dandava Pranam.
Thank you. Anything else? Yeah. Discuss before we move on.
Hi Krishnaji, thank you for the class. I wanted to ask about the false ego. How will we know that the false ego is removed? And also, how do we develop our spiritual identity?
So we actually have that realization. It can be gradual, it can actually also be sudden. This is what sometimes they call spiritual awakening, where one realizes that one isn't all the thoughts, all the feelings, all of the ideas, all of the perceptions that they've had. There's actual a realization that this is not me. I'm not all of this. So, like we said, the problem is that once you realize that you're not all of that, the impersonalists realize the problem is you don't have any sense of what you actually are. You know you're not all these things that you thought you are, but you don't have a sense of who you are. So with a devotee, it's very different. As they're realizing they're not all of this, they're also realizing what they are, because that spiritual personality of theirs, that eternal identity that they have in the spiritual world of Krishna, that's also awakening at the same time. So when they're not when they're getting over the fact that they're not this person from this planet, from this certain home, from this social position, they're also understanding, oh, I have this relationship with Krishna. They're feeling those feelings. They're getting that sense. So the way we get to this is by prosecuting devotional service. So this, of course, is explained in the steps from Shara to Prema. One begins with faith. One engages in devotional service amongst devotees, sadhusanga and bhajana kriya. Through that association, and particularly chanting the holy names, hearing Srimad Bhagavatam, rendering service to the devotees, as well as other potent items of devotional service, like serving the deity and serving the holy dance, going to parikram. Through all these activities of devotional service, one is able to get to an art of liberty. One has most or a lot of one's material contaminations, offensive, sinful behavior, all removed at that stage. Then one actually starts to become more fixed in their practices. The faith is getting stronger because all the contaminations of material life are removed. So one continues all those activities of devotional service, continues chanting, continues reading, continues serving the devotees. And one gets then to ruchi, one finds taste in chanting the holy names. One is actually more attentive to chanting, and through that one is able to get to the final stage. One is able to get to the stage of asakti, where finally all the material contaminations are gone. So all material contaminations are almost destroyed, Srimad Bhagavatam says, at the stage of anartha liberty. But then at asakti, all of them are completely gone. So we understand that when we are rid of this false ego for food at that stage of asakti, this is when that real ego is manifest and we are able to understand who we are. We glimpse it, let's put it that way, because it develops in stages. And then at the next level of bhava, we have preliminary love of God, where we can actually start feeling our love for Krishna, and then that's matured at the stage of prema. So we see there's this gradual progression, and we just need to keep going with the chanting attentively, with reading and hearing Srimad Bhagavatam, with associating with devotees. All these activities are there to keep helping us progress through the stages until we can actually get to this point of understanding that we're not something and understanding what we actually are. Is that okay, Prabhu?
Thank you, Maharaj. Hare Krishna.
Thank you. Hare Krishna. We will, bhajan today. So it's very nice bhajan by the Thakur. And why I thought it was a very nice choice for today is that he's explaining about the miseries of the material quite clearly. And it makes us understand that the real austerities are not observing nirjala ekadasi without water. It's not anything, any parent austerities in devotional service or rules and regulations that we have to follow. We've actually always been in misery and suffering. We just have no idea about it. Everything in this material world is actually like that. So we just have to understand this and give our hearts to the devotional process and let it transform us. Like Krishna explains in the Bhagavad Gita, what seems like poison at first and becomes nectar at the end, that's the nature of devotion. That's nature of goodness. That which is nectar in the beginning and poison at the end is nature of passion. And that which is poison at the beginning and poison at the end, that's the nature of ignorance. So mostly we've been in passion, trying to elevate ourselves to goodness and then even beyond goodness through the transcendental stage of devotional service. So we are grateful for these service opportunities like Nirjala Ekadasi to expand our consciousness of the Lord, and also to those saints who helped us to get to this point. Yesterday was the disappearance day of Srila Baladev Vibhushan, disappearance day of Gangamata Goswami, great devotees in the line of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and we offer our respects to them for their teaching efforts that ensure that we have this great in our lives also. So we will sing this bhajan, Vidyara, Vilas, Vedanta, Vilas, Caitanya Kala Paramahasahasayami Tomara Charana Na Bhajinu Kabu Ekona Sharana Tumi Bodhite Bodhite Bharasa Bhari Lo Kyane Gati Habe Mani Se Asha Vipala Se Jnana Durbala Se Jnana Agyata Jani Jada Vidya Jata Maya Ravai Bhava Tomara Bhajane Bada Moha Janamiya Anitya Samsare Jiva ke koraye gada Se gadha hoye Samsare ra bhoja Bahinu aneka kala Bharda ke khuna Shakira abhave Kichu nahi lage balo Jivan jatana Oilo ekona ha se vidya avidya phelo avidyara jwala घाती लोकी क्षमा से विद्या होय शेलो तुम्हारा चारणा धीना किछु धाना संसारे न आचे आरा भागति विनो Jadavidyachaari Duapada Kore Tara Vidyara Vilase Caitanya Kala Parama Sahase Ami Soma Charame Na Bhajinu Kapu Ekona Sharana Kuni. There is a translation. With great enthusiasm, I spent my time in pleasures of mundane learning and never worshipped your lotus feet, O Lord. Now you are my only shelter. Reading on and on, my hopes grew and grew, for I considered the acquisition of material knowledge to be life's true goal. How fruitless those hopes turned out to be, for all my knowledge proved feeble. Now I know that all such erudition is actually pure ignorance. All the so-called knowledge of this world is born of the flickering potency of your virtually empty your Maya. It is an impediment to the execution of devotional service to you. Indulgence in mundane knowledge rarely makes the ass of the eternal soul by encouraging the perpetuation of this temporary world. Here is one person who has been turned into such an ass, who for so long has carried on his back the useless burden of the world. Now in my old age, for once, the power to enjoy, find that nothing. Life has now become agony, for my so-called erudite knowledge has proved itself to be worthless ignorance. Material knowledge has now become a pointed sharp and has pierced my heart with the intolerable, burning pain of ignorance. O Lord, there is no treasure worth keeping in this world other than your lotus feet. Bhaktivinoda abandons all his mundane knowledge and makes your lotus feet the sun and substance of his mind. Shri Shanidai Gaura Hari Ki Jai.